He had always enjoyed wandering through quiet neighborhoods and forgotten corners of the town. There was something peaceful about stepping into places where time seemed to have slowed down. One chilly morning, while driving along an old, nearly invisible road, he noticed a small, crumbling cabin tucked between tall pines. Its roof sagged, the paint was peeling, and the windows were either broken or missing. For most people, it would have seemed completely worthless. But for him, there was a spark of curiosity. Something about the cabin drew him closer. As if it had a story it wanted someone to hear, he parked his car on the side of the road and walked toward it. The air smelled of damp leaves and old wood. A few birds chirped above, seemingly unbothered by the abandoned structure below. As he looked around, he noticed that the cabin wasn't entirely forgotten. There were signs of previous occupants, broken furniture lying in the yard, a rusted swing hanging from a tree, and a small garden, overrun with weeds. It was clear that no one had cared for this place in years. Yet despite the neglect, he could imagine the cabin's past life. He pictured children laughing in the yard, a family gathering around a fireplace, and the smell of food cooking in the kitchen. Somehow, he felt connected to that history, even though he didn't know it yet. Back home, he began looking into the cabin. He wasn't the type to buy property impulsively. He had learned early on that patience and research were far more valuable than luck. So he pulled up old property records and scanned local real estate listings. To his surprise, the cabin was not listed anywhere. That raised questions in his mind. How could a property like this, in a seemingly quiet and accessible area, go unnoticed for so long? He decided to dig deeper, contacting the local municipal office to understand the cabin's history. The clerk at the municipal office seemed puzzled when he asked about it. "That cabin?" she said, tapping a few keys on her computer. "It's been abandoned for years. The owner stopped paying property fees, and it was supposed to be claimed by the Homeowners Association. Nobody ever did anything with it." She shrugged as if it were a matter of routine. Honestly, most people wouldn't touch it. Too much work, too little value. This was exactly what intrigued him. The cabin was considered worthless by everyone, but he had always believed that value was about more than money. He believed that if you were willing to invest time, effort, and care, you could create something extraordinary from what others ignored. He asked the clerk about the legal process for claiming abandoned property. She explained that there was a provision for purchasing properties with unpaid fees, sometimes for a symbolic amount. In some cases, it could even be as low as 25 cents. The moment the clerk mentioned it, he felt a thrill. 25 cents. That was all it would take to turn this forgotten cabin into something of his own. Of course, he didn't rush. He wanted to make sure everything was done properly. He spent weeks reviewing old deeds, understanding the history of ownership, and checking whether the Homeowners Association had any real claim left. It was a careful process, but he liked that. He enjoyed unraveling details that others overlooked. Every document he found, every record he read, made the story of the cabin feel more alive. Finally, the day came when he could take the necessary steps. He went to the municipal office with a tiny coin in his pocket. It felt strange, almost symbolic, like the world was giving him a secret opportunity that nobody else had noticed. The clerk processed the paperwork, signed off on the legal forms, and handed him the official deed. At that moment, he became the owner of the cabin. 25 cents had bought him not just a property, but a chance to create something new from the old and forgotten. The first visit after the purchase was emotional. He walked up the overgrown path, pushed open the creaking door, and stepped inside. Dust hung in the air, the floorboards groaned under his weight, and the smell of old wood and decay was strong. He could see the full extent of the work ahead. Every wall, every corner, every inch of the cabin needed attention. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, he felt alive. This was the kind of challenge he had always wanted. He wasn't buying the cabin for money or status. He was buying it because he saw potential where others saw neglect. Neighbors were curious, but most didn't expect much. A few waved politely, some chuckled, and others shook their heads in disbelief. Who would bother with that old shack? They whispered among themselves. But he ignored them. He had learned long ago that when people dismiss your vision, it often means you're on the right path. He didn't need approval or applause. He only needed commitment and patience. He started slowly. First, he cleaned up the yard, removing broken furniture, weeds, and debris. He patched holes in the roof to stop the rain from leaking in, reinforced the floors where they were weak, and secured the windows with temporary boards to keep out the wind and animals. Every small success felt like a victory. Even something as simple as clearing out an overgrown garden became a project of love. He planted a few flowers and small shrubs, imagining what the space could look like in a year. Every day, he felt a growing sense of pride. Sometimes, while working, he would sit in the cabin and listen to the sounds of the forest around him. The rustling leaves, the distant calls of birds, and the gentle wind through the trees became part of his routine. In the quiet, he found clarity and focus. The cabin was no longer just a structure. It became a place of reflection, a space where he could dream and plan. He imagined evenings by a fireplace, mornings with sunlight streaming through the windows, and quiet nights listening to the world outside. During this time, he also learned about the history of the area. He spoke to older residents who remembered the cabin in its prime. They shared stories of families gathering there, of children playing in the yard, and of how the cabin had once been full of life. Listening to these stories deepened his connection to the place. It was no longer just a project. It was a part of the town's history, a living memory waiting to be honored. As the weeks turned into months, the transformation became visible. The cabin, once crumbling and forgotten, started to regain its shape and dignity. He repaired the doors, painted the walls, and even installed a small, functional kitchen. It wasn't luxurious, but it was comfortable and welcoming. Each improvement was a reminder of what patience and dedication could achieve. He often smiled at the progress, imagining how the cabin would look once it was fully restored, yet he knew that not everyone would be happy with his efforts. Some neighbors still looked skeptical. A few asked questions, clearly hinting that the Homeowners Association might take an interest again. But he didn't let that worry him. The law was on his side, and he had followed every step carefully. The cabin belonged to him now, legally and rightfully. He understood that sooner or later, challenges might come, but he was ready to face them. For now, he focused on the joy of building, creating, and caring for something that others had abandoned. By the end of the year, the cabin had undergone a remarkable change. What had once been a forgotten eyesore now looked like a modest, charming retreat. The garden bloomed with colorful flowers. The roof was solid and sturdy, and the windows sparkled in the sunlight. He often walked through the cabin, imagining the stories that could unfold here, the quiet moments of solitude and the laughter that might return one day. Each improvement was a testament to his vision and perseverance. The first part of his journey had taught him something valuable. The world often overlooks hidden treasures, and sometimes opportunities come at the smallest cost, like 25 cents. But it was not the money that mattered. It was vision, patience, and the courage to act when others hesitated. The cabin had become more than a property. It was a symbol of resilience, a project of the heart, and a place where determination could turn neglect into something beautiful. As he looked at the cabin one evening, with the sun casting long shadows across the yard, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had done more than buy a building. He had breathed life into a forgotten corner of the world. And yet, he also knew that this was only the beginning. There were still challenges ahead, questions to answer, and perhaps conflicts to face. But for now, he allowed himself to enjoy the quiet triumph of turning a 25-cent purchase into something truly meaningful. The cabin, once lost to time, was now his, and in that, he found a profound sense of fulfillment. The first winter after buying the cabin arrived with quiet, icy mornings and long nights. The wind whipped through the trees, rattling branches against the roof, and snow covered the ground in a soft, unbroken blanket. For most people, this would have been a challenge, but for him, it became another opportunity to prove the cabin's worth. He had spent months transforming the structure into a basic but welcoming retreat, and now it was time to see if it could withstand the cold and the harsh weather that came with the season. He had learned early that owning a property, even one bought for 25 cents, required commitment. The cabin could not be treated as a simple project anymore. It had to be cared for as a home, however small and modest it was. He stocked up on firewood, checked the insulation, and reinforced the windows with extra boards. Each task was tedious, but he approached it with the patience of someone who understood that small actions created long-term results. He could almost hear the cabin sighing in relief as he made each repair, as if it appreciated the care it was finally receiving, even during the harshest winter days. He spent hours inside the cabin, sitting by the small wood stove he had installed. The fire crackled and warmed the space, and he felt a sense of accomplishment as he looked around. The walls, though simple, had been repaired, the floors cleaned and strengthened. The furniture, though sparse, made the cabin functional. He often thought about how strange it was that this place, which had been considered worthless by so many, now offered comfort and warmth. The contrast was sharp, but it also reminded him why he had taken the chance in the first place. Outside, the neighborhood remained quiet. Some neighbors occasionally walked by, curious about the man who had claimed the forgotten cabin. They would peek through the trees, whisper to each other, and occasionally nod politely. Most of them still seemed skeptical, unable to understand why anyone would invest time and effort into a property that had been left to ruin. But he had long stopped worrying about their opinions. Their doubts and laughter were nothing compared to the sense of purpose he felt each morning as he stepped through the cabin door. As spring approached, he began planning more ambitious improvements. The winter had been a test, and he had passed it. The cabin was now sturdy enough to support further work, and the surrounding land had started to reveal its potential. He cleared fallen branches, dug up weeds, and started creating a small path leading from the road to the cabin. He imagined a welcoming garden with flowers and shrubs that would bloom in the summer, and perhaps even a small vegetable patch. It was more than a project. It was a vision, a chance to create beauty where there had once been neglect. He also began documenting everything he did. Every repair, every improvement, every purchase and receipt was carefully recorded. He knew that ownership might not always be respected, and having proof of his work could be important in the future. It felt tedious at times, but he treated it as part of the responsibility of being a caretaker. More than that, it gave him a sense of control. In a world where so many things were unpredictable, keeping detailed records gave him confidence that he was doing everything right. Neighbors started noticing the changes. The cabin, once crumbling and ignored, was beginning to look alive again. They saw flowers growing in the garden, the freshly repaired roof, and the small path that had been cleared. Some of them nodded in quiet appreciation, though most still kept their distance. A few even asked questions about what he planned next. He answered politely without revealing too much. He had learned that people were often suspicious of sudden transformation, especially in places they assumed to belong to the community rather than an individual. One of the most satisfying parts of the process was seeing the wildlife return. Birds began nesting in the trees around the cabin, squirrels darted along the branches, and even a few deer wandered close to the yard. The area, once silent and empty, had started to feel alive again. He would spend hours sitting on the porch, watching the animals, and listening to the sounds of nature. It reminded him that the cabin was not just a building, it was part of a living ecosystem, and his efforts were helping it flourish once more. As summer arrived, he tackled more challenging projects. He repaired the small porch, reinforcing the wood and painting it a bright color that contrasted with the natural tones of the cabin. He added a bench and a simple table, creating a space where he could sit and enjoy the quiet beauty of the forest. He installed basic lighting inside, making the cabin feel warmer and more welcoming. Each improvement required time, effort, and patience, but the results were undeniable. The cabin had gone from a forgotten shack to a small, functional retreat that could stand the test of time. During these months, he also got to know some of the locals who had lived in the area for decades. They shared stories about the cabin's past, telling him about the family who had once owned it, the gatherings that had taken place, and even the challenges they faced when maintaining it. Listening to these stories deepened his connection to the place. It was no longer just a property. It had a history, a soul, and he felt honored to be its caretaker. Each story motivated him to continue, to restore not just the physical structure but also the sense of life that had once surrounded it. Despite his progress, he remained cautious. The cabin was technically part of a community governed by a homeowners association, even if it had been neglected for years. He knew that as soon as the cabin became valuable, people might start questioning his ownership. He also knew that neighbors who had ignored the property might suddenly take an interest once it looked attractive. So he kept careful records, maintained clear documentation of every payment and improvement, and stayed informed about local regulations. He was determined to protect what he had earned, but he did so quietly, without confrontation. By the end of the first year, the cabin had undergone a remarkable transformation. The yard was clean and welcoming, with small flowers and shrubs adding color. The porch was sturdy and functional, and the cabin itself was warm, dry, and fully livable. He could sit by the stove in the evening, enjoy a simple meal, and feel proud of what he had accomplished. The transformation was not just physical, it was deeply personal. Each repair, each improvement, and each hour spent caring for the cabin had strengthened his sense of purpose and patience. He often reflected on the journey that had brought him here. A forgotten, abandoned property had seemed worthless to everyone else. Yet he had seen its potential and had been willing to invest not money, but time, effort, and care. That vision had turned a 25-cent purchase into a meaningful, valuable place. It was a reminder that sometimes the world overlooks hidden treasures, and that courage, persistence, and dedication can turn even the most unlikely opportunity into something extraordinary. Yet, even as he celebrated his success, he knew the story was far from over. The cabin had now attracted attention, subtle but undeniable. A few neighbors had started asking questions about ownership. There had been quiet whispers about the Homeowners Association taking notice. He anticipated challenges ahead, but he felt prepared. He had spent the past year building not just the cabin, but a strong foundation of evidence, knowledge, an experience that would help him defend what was rightfully his. Every evening, he would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the forest. The colors of the sky reflected on the cabin walls, and the quiet sounds of nature surrounded him. He thought about how far the cabin had come, from a forgotten shack to a modest retreat full of life and potential. He also thought about the lessons he had learned about patience, persistence, and the importance of seeing value where others do not. It was not a journey about money or profit. It was about creating something meaningful, and in that, he had succeeded beyond his own expectations. As the first anniversary of his purchase approached, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The cabin was no longer just a building. It was a symbol of his vision and determination. It had become a place where he could reflect, plan, and dream. A place that belonged entirely to him because he had nurtured it from neglect to life. And while he knew that the Homeowners Association and curious neighbors might create obstacles in the future, he was confident that he had the knowledge, records, and courage to face whatever came next. The cabin had transformed not just physically, but emotionally. It had become a quiet sanctuary, a reward for patience, and a testament to what could happen when someone refused to be deterred by skepticism or doubt. He had proven that effort, care, and persistence could turn something seemingly worthless into something of value. Not just in money, but in pride, purpose, and connection to the past. And so, the second year began with promise. The cabin stood proudly among the trees, a small but undeniable sign that one person's dedication could change the fate of a forgotten place. He continued to care for it, improve it, and protect it, knowing that the peace and fulfillment it brought were worth every ounce of effort. The journey of the cabin was far from over, but the first year had already shown that with vision, patience, and determination. Even the most abandoned and overlooked places could be restored to life by the time the cabin had been restored and fully transformed into a small but welcoming retreat. Life had begun to feel calm and rewarding. The quiet mornings with the sunlight filtering through the trees, the soft rustle of leaves, and the occasional visit from wildlife had become part of his daily rhythm. It was a peaceful, satisfying existence, and for a while it seemed like the world had left him and his cabin alone. But peace is often fragile, and as the summer grew warmer, he started noticing subtle signs that he was no longer the only one paying attention to the cabin. At first, it was small things: a neighbor lingering at the edge of the property, a quick glance from someone walking by, whispers that carried across the yard. He didn't react immediately. He had learned that curiosity and concern were normal in a community, especially when someone had transformed a property that had been ignored for so long. He continued his work quietly, focusing on maintaining and improving the cabin. Then came the first letter. It was delivered in a plain envelope, without ceremony, and at first glance, he thought it might be a routine notice or a piece of mail misdirected to him. But as he opened it and read the contents, his stomach tightened. It was from the Homeowners Association. The words were formal and curt. They claimed that the cabin had been sold in error. It was never meant to leave the association's control, and that he was required to surrender it immediately. They demanded a response within a very short time frame, and the tone left little room for discussion. He sat back, holding the letter, trying to process what it meant. For a year, he had followed the law, maintained the property, and improved it beyond recognition. The purchase had been legal, the documentation complete, and the municipal office had approved the sale. Yet here was the association, claiming ownership after the fact, as if the past year had not happened. His first instinct was disbelief, followed quickly by frustration. How could they suddenly decide that the cabin was theirs when they had done nothing for so long? He spent the next few days reviewing every document, every record, and every piece of evidence he had accumulated since the day he purchased the cabin. The more he examined it, the more certain he became that he had done everything correctly. He had legal proof of purchase, receipts for improvements, photographs of the cabin before and after repairs, and correspondence with the municipal office confirming the legitimacy of the sale. The Homeowners Association might try to intimidate him, but he was prepared. Despite his confidence, he couldn't ignore the anxiety that crept in. The association had influence, and they could make life difficult if he didn't respond carefully. He had seen how these organizations operated: sudden demands, threats of legal action, and attempts to pressure property owners into surrendering their rights. He knew he had to act carefully with strategy and patience, or risk losing what he had worked so hard to build. He decided the first step was to respond calmly, without anger. He wrote a detailed letter back to the association, outlining the legal purchase, the lack of prior action on their part, and the improvements he had made. He attached copies of every document he could find, hoping that presenting facts clearly would make it impossible for them to claim ignorance. He also stated politely but firmly that he intended to retain ownership, and that any dispute should be handled through proper legal channels rather than threats or intimidation. Sending the letter felt like a small victory, but he knew it was only the beginning. Within days, responses from the association started arriving, some formal and some more threatening. They insisted that the cabin had always belonged to the community, that the sale was invalid, and that he had no right to occupy or improve the property. Their tone suggested that they assumed he would give up, that the cabin would be easier to reclaim if they created enough pressure. He felt a mix of anger and determination. He had worked too hard, invested too much, and cared too deeply to back down now. Word began to spread through the neighborhood. People who had ignored the cabin for years now took interest. Some siding with the association, others curious to see what would happen. Some neighbors approached him politely, asking questions and hinting at concern. Others were more blunt, suggesting that he should comply with the association's demands to avoid trouble. The attention was uncomfortable, but he reminded himself that standing firm was part of the process. Ownership was not about convenience. It was about right and fairness. As the weeks passed, he found himself preparing for a potential legal battle. He met with a local lawyer to discuss the case, sharing all the documentation he had gathered. The lawyer was impressed by the thoroughness of his records and agreed that his claim was strong. "You did everything right," the lawyer said. "This cabin is legally yours. The association might try to intimidate you, but they have no real grounds to take it back." Hearing this was reassuring, but he knew that reassurance alone would not stop the association from causing difficulties. He needed to remain vigilant, ready for any escalation. During this tense period, he continued improving the cabin, refusing to let the conflict consume his life entirely. He repaired the remaining parts of the roof, added small decorative touches, worked on the garden, ensuring that the space remained welcoming and peaceful. Each improvement felt like a declaration. The cabin was not just a building. It was a reflection of his effort, vision, and commitment. Even as the association challenged his right to it, he refused to allow fear to dictate his actions. Late one afternoon, while he was pruning bushes near the front of the cabin, a group of association representatives appeared. They walked slowly across the yard, notebooks in hand, examining the property with expressions that were difficult to read. They asked questions, took photographs, made comments that suggested they were documenting every detail for potential legal proceedings. He greeted them politely, answered their questions, and observed their behavior carefully. Every interaction became part of the ongoing record he maintained. Evidence of their sudden interest and the actions he had already taken to maintain the cabin. The encounter was tense. He had spent a year building the cabin, turning a neglected structure into a functioning and welcoming home. The thought of surrendering it because of threats or pressure was unacceptable. As the representatives left, he felt a mix of relief and renewed determination. The cabin had survived abandonment, harsh weather, and months of intense work. It would not be taken from him without a fight. Neighbors continued to watch the situation unfold. Some quietly cheering him on, others critical of his decision to resist the association. He learned to tune out the noise and focus on the facts. His priority was the cabin, not public opinion. He also began to notice a subtle shift in the neighborhood dynamic. The cabin, once ignored and dismissed, had become a symbol of resilience. People who had once considered it worthless now had to acknowledge the transformation he had achieved through dedication and hard work. One evening, after a long day of repairs and preparing responses to the association, he sat on the porch and looked out at the forest. The setting sun cast a golden glow across the yard, highlighting the flowers, shrubs, and the freshly repaired exterior of the cabin. It was a moment of quiet reflection amid the tension and uncertainty. He realized that no matter what happened next, he had already proven something important: that effort, care, and persistence could turn neglect into value, and that standing firm for what was right mattered more than convenience or fear. The following weeks were filled with a mixture of small victories and continued challenges. The association sent letters, demanding explanations, questioned his improvements, and hinted at potential legal action. Each time he responded with facts, documentation, and calm reasoning. He refused to be drawn into anger or argument, knowing that maintaining a clear, professional approach would strengthen his position. Every letter he sent became another piece of evidence that he had acted responsibly and legally. As tensions grew, he also found unexpected support from some community members. People who had admired his work quietly expressed respect and encouragement, offering advice or assistance. These small gestures reminded him that while opposition existed, there were also allies who appreciated the value of perseverance and integrity. It was encouraging to know that his efforts were being noticed not just by the association, but by those who understood the dedication behind the transformation of the cabin. By the end of the season, the situation had reached a critical point. The association, frustrated by his refusal to comply and his thorough documentation, began considering legal proceedings more seriously. He anticipated this development and continued preparing, confident in the strength of his case. The cabin, which had started as a forgotten property worth 25 cents, had now become a symbol of determination and resilience, attracting attention and admiration despite the conflict. Through it all, he never lost sight of why he had pursued the cabin in the first place. It had never been about money or prestige. It was about seeing potential where others saw neglect, about turning effort into tangible results, and about creating a space that reflected care, patience, and vision. The conflict with the Homeowners Association, while stressful, also reinforced these values. It reminded him that standing up for what was right often required courage, persistence, and unwavering commitment. As the days grew longer and the year progressed, he continued to care for the cabin and the surrounding land. Each improvement, each small detail, became a testament to his dedication. And while the association loomed as a potential challenge, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The cabin had survived abandonment, weather, and neglect, and now it would survive bureaucracy and opposition as well. It was no longer just a building. It was a statement of perseverance, patience, an unwavering belief in the value of effort. He often thought back to the moment he first discovered the cabin, crumbling and ignored, and smiled at how far it had come. What had seemed like a small, insignificant property worth 25 cents had grown into something meaningful, both physically and emotionally. And while the future remained uncertain, he was determined to protect what he had built, confident that truth, persistence, and care would prevail in the end. The tension with the Homeowners Association had been building for months, and by the start of the next season, it reached a point where ignoring it was no longer an option. Letters, visits, and subtle warnings had escalated into clear threats of legal action. Despite this, he refused to panic. He had invested more than money into this cabin. He had invested time, effort, and heart. Walking away was not an option. The cabin had become a part of him, a testament to what dedication could achieve. He was determined to protect it. He began by gathering all the evidence he could. Every receipt, every photograph, every piece of correspondence was collected and organized carefully. The improvements he had made over the past year, from fixing the roof to clearing the yard and planting the garden, were all documented in detail. He even took notes about the state of the property when he first purchased it, highlighting the neglect and abandonment that the association had ignored for so long. To him, this was not just preparation for a potential battle. It was a way of proving the truth. The cabin had been forgotten, abandoned, and left to decay. He had revived it, and he had the records to show it. Meetings with the association were inevitable. One afternoon, representatives arrived at the cabin, their expressions formal, their tone polite but firm. They insisted on discussing the property in person, claiming that the sale had been improper and that he should return the cabin immediately. He welcomed them onto the porch, offering tea and a seat, refusing to be intimidated. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the urgency in their voices. He listened carefully, took notes, and responded politely, citing every law document and record that supported his ownership. It became clear during that first meeting that the association had underestimated him. They expected him to be startled by the threats or confused by the legal language. They assumed that he would comply to avoid trouble. Instead, he stood firm. He explained the sequence of events, how the cabin had been abandoned, the process he had followed to purchase it legally, and the improvements he had made. Each fact was presented clearly, without emotion or argument. The calm and methodical approach left the representatives momentarily silent. They could argue all they wanted, but the facts were undeniable. The meeting ended without resolution, and he knew that more challenges were coming. The association began sending repeated letters, each one more forceful than the last. They suggested that legal action was imminent, that they might seek to reclaim the property through court. Instead of reacting with fear, he continued to respond with facts and documentation. Each response was measured, polite, and firm, reinforcing his ownership while maintaining a professional tone. He understood that losing control of his emotions would be far more dangerous than any external threat. The neighborhood, meanwhile, had become aware of the conflict. Some neighbors approached him quietly, expressing support or admiration for his efforts. Others continued to side with the association, questioning why he would resist what they considered the rules. But he refused to engage in gossip or arguments. The cabin and the work he had done were the only matters that mattered. Words from others could not change the truth. What mattered was evidence, persistence. And staying true to his principles, days turned into weeks, and the association attempted more aggressive tactics. They sent inspectors to evaluate the property, questioned neighbors about ownership, even suggested that he had no right to make improvements. Each attempt only strengthened his resolve. He carefully documented every interaction, every visit, in every attempt to challenge his ownership. Each record became another layer of protection, a buffer against intimidation, and a reminder that he had approached this entire process with honesty and diligence. He also began to notice a shift in the association's behavior. Their confidence started to waver as they realized that he was not going to surrender the cabin easily. They began to rely on threats rather than facts, attempting to pressure him with letters and phone calls. But he refused to engage in fear. He had spent over a year transforming the cabin, turning it from a neglected shack into a welcoming retreat. Walking away would erase months of effort, but standing firm could prove that commitment, preparation, and honesty mattered more than power or intimidation. One afternoon, as he worked on the garden, he noticed a group of association representatives at the edge of the property again. They seemed frustrated, taking photographs and measuring parts of the yard. He approached them calmly, asking if they needed assistance. Their expressions hardened, and they insisted that he leave the property. He calmly explained that he was the legal owner and had every right to be there. The conversation grew tense, but he remained composed, refusing to raise his voice or let anger take control. In that moment, the cabin itself seemed to symbolize more than a building. It was a statement of endurance, patience, and rightful ownership. The summer sun beat down on the cabin, illuminating the changes he had made. The garden flourished, the porch stood strong, and the repairs to the roof and walls were solid. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction looking at the property. The cabin was no longer just a physical space. It was a reflection of his commitment and vision. Each improvement was a silent response to the association's challenges, proof that he had invested far more than anyone could understand or appreciate. Neighbors began to take notice again, some quietly admiring the transformation, others whispering concerns about the conflict. He welcomed the quiet support, but ignored the criticism. What mattered was not opinion but fact. The cabin, once abandoned and dismissed, now stood as evidence that dedication and effort could reclaim something others had abandoned. Each interaction, each improvement, reinforced the idea that he was not only preserving a structure, but also asserting a principle, that fairness and effort must be respected. The conflict eventually drew the attention of local officials. When he visited the municipal office to check records and ensure that his documentation was up to date, staff members began to recognize him and his dedication to the property. Some even expressed quiet admiration for the work he had done, noting that it was rare for someone to invest so much effort into a place that others had ignored for so long. These small acknowledgments were encouraging, but he remained focused on the larger challenge, the Homeowners Association. He spent long evenings, reviewing every legal document, consulting with his lawyer, and preparing for the possibility of a court case. Each piece of paperwork, each photograph, each record of communication with the association was meticulously organized. He knew that if the dispute escalated, he would need a complete and undeniable record of his ownership and the improvements he had made. Preparation became his shield, patience became his strategy, and calm became his most powerful tool. Despite the stress and tension, he continued to live fully in the cabin. He cooked simple meals, enjoyed quiet walks in the surrounding woods, and took pride in the garden he had nurtured. The physical labor of tending the property became a way to manage anxiety and focus his energy. Every repair, every plant, every improvement was both practical and symbolic, demonstration that the cabin was his, not just in law, but in effort, care, and love. By the end of the summer, the association's tactics were becoming predictable. They continued sending letters, making inspections, and attempting to intimidate him, but he had learned their patterns and remained 2 steps ahead. Each move they made was countered with calm, measured responses backed by documentation and legal advice. It was not a battle of anger or impulse. It was a battle of preparation, principle, and patience. And in that, he felt confident. He also began to reflect on what this struggle meant personally. The cabin had started as a forgotten structure, purchased for 25 cents, and had become a symbol of resilience and integrity. He realized that the challenges with the Homeowners Association, while frustrating, were teaching him lessons about perseverance, justice, and the importance of standing firm. Every letter, visit, and threat only reinforced the values he had applied from the very beginning: careful research, hard work, and dedication to what was right. Even as the association continued their pressure, he found moments of joy and reflection. Sitting on the porch in the late afternoon, watching sunlight filter through the trees, he felt a sense of peace. The cabin, once abandoned and ignored, now radiated life and purpose. It was a reminder that determination and care could transform the smallest investment, a 25-cent purchase, into something invaluable. Each flower, each repaired floorboard, each clean window was proof that effort mattered, and that standing firm for what was right could not be undone by threats or intimidation. As the season drew to a close, he felt ready for whatever came next. The Homeowners Association might escalate the conflict, but he was prepared. The cabin was more than a structure. It was a testament to his patience, persistence, and courage. He had faced months of uncertainty and intimidation and had emerged stronger, more confident, and more determined to protect what was his. Each day spent caring for the property reinforced his belief that hard work and principle mattered more than power or intimidation.